So hello and welcome to the I-STARR training series. I-STARR stands for Infrastructure for Studying Treatment and Addiction Recovery Residences. So the I-STARR project aims to develop infrastructure to advance science on recovery housing, particularly recovery housing for persons treated with medications for opioid use disorder, which I'll refer to throughout this presentation as MOUD. So this training is the first webinar in the I-STARR training series. This is a training that's geared towards any and all folks who are interested in learning about recovery housing, and reflecting that we wanted to make sure that this covered all recovery housing basics. We've called it our Recovery Housing 101 webinar. So the I-STARR project is supported by a grant from the National Institute on Drug Abuse. It's part of the larger NIH Helping to End Addiction Long-Term, or the HEAL initiative, and it's one of several projects that comprise the Consortium on Addiction Recovery Science, or the CEUs network. So before we launch, just a couple of quick notes about the format of these presentations. So all audience members are currently muted. We encourage all folks to use the Zoom chat function to introduce themselves, to connect with fellow audience members, and to ask questions of our presenters. Actually, we have an I-STARR project staff member monitoring the chat, and we'll unmute folks at the end of the presentation so that folks can raise their hands and we can have discussion at that point. So this webinar and each webinar in this series is being recorded so that all folks, even those who couldn't make it today, can learn from this presentation. Next slide, please. So I'm Amy Maracle. I'm a research scientist in the Alcohol Research Group at the Public Health Institute. I co-lead the I-STARR project with Dr. Carmen Masson, who's a professor of psychiatry in the School of Medicine at the University of California, San Francisco. The I-STARR team also includes co-investigators Sarah Zemore, Lenny Jason, biostatisticians Mina Subaraman and Libo Lee, and communications specialists Diane Schmidt and Dustin Kebzu. We've also been extremely lucky in this first year of our project to have Adrienne Faxio serving as the I-STARR project coordinator to help us launch this series before she moves on, actually at the end of this week, to another project outside of ARG. Thank you, Adrienne, for all of your help today and for all of your work leading up to this webinar. Next slide, please. So the I-STARR project activities are also guided by an 18-member advisory board comprised of a diverse group of leaders from across the country. And while most advisory board members wear many, actually often multiple hats, they represent different stakeholder groups, recovery and recovery housing leaders, treatment providers and payers, national policy advocates, as well as researchers and educators. I see that some of the advisory board members are in our audience, and I'm excited to share that some of our board members will also serve as presenters in this webinar series. In fact, you'll actually hear from one of our board members later today. So some of you may notice an asterisk by Jim Sorensen's name. Sadly, if you haven't heard, Jim Sorensen passed away last month. He was actually, ironically, one of the first persons I reached out to when I was planning this project. And both Dr. Carmen Masson and myself, like so many others over the years, were lucky enough to train with Dr. Sorensen as postdoctoral scholars at UCSF. And we're even luckier to continue working with him after we completed our training. So needless to say, he'll be sorely missed on this project and from the field, but his influence will continue to be reflected in our work because he truly shaped so much of what I know about substance use disorders, substance use treatment, and mostly substance use treatment research. Next slide, please. So that's a little bit of background on the I-STARR project. But before I introduce today's webinar and webinar presenters, I'd like to do some quick polling to get a quick pulse on the virtual room here. There are just 3 questions in this poll. We want to hear about what best describes your profession or role as it pertains to recovery housing, how familiar you are with different types of recovery housing, and how familiar you are with the evidence base for recovery housing. So Zoom will pull up the poll on your computer screen. And even though there are just 3 questions, you may have to scroll through to see all 3 of them. And Zoom actually won't let you exit the polling screen unless you answer all 3 of the questions. So I'll pause here for a few seconds so that people can complete the poll. Okay, so it looks like we have a good chunk of our attendees represented in the polling, and here's what folks had to say. So it looks like the largest group of folks that we have represented in the webinar are actually providers, but there's also another large group of folks who are identifying as something else. So if those folks can type into the chat how you would identify your role as it pertains to recovery housing, that will help us refine our survey and our polling procedures in the next webinars. So with respect to familiarity with recovery housing, most folks seem pretty familiar with recovery housing, but there is a range. The scale ranges from 1 to 5. There's a group of folks in the number 4 category. But with respect to familiarity with the evidence base for recovery housing, it's more in the middle. But again, we have a good range there. And given these responses, I think I can say that there'll be something in here for everyone. If you're looking to learn about recovery housing, you're definitely in the right place. I'm also a little bit excited that we have folks here who are more familiar with recovery housing, and that we have these folks in the mix so that you can share your experiences and your insights on the topic with others. Next slide, please. So we have 2 different presenters for this webinar. I'll be presenting on the evidence base for recovery housing, but the real headliner today is Dave Sheridan. Dave Sheridan is a pretty impressive guy with an amazing background, and I couldn't be more pleased that he's leading off the I-STARR training series. So Dave is a charter board member and past board president of the National Alliance for Recovery Residences, or NAR, and he currently serves as NAR's executive director. In addition to being on the I-STARR advisory board, he's also a board member and treasurer of the Chandler Lodge Foundation in Los Angeles and served for a decade on the board of directors for Southern California's Sober Living Network. As a national speaker and writer on recovery residence issues, his work focuses on developing statewide systems for supporting quality recovery housing, and he also serves as an advocate and a resource on fair housing issues. Dave's professional training is actually in institutional investment management, which includes portfolio management, investment strategies, and new project development for investment firms and their clients. And if you weren't impressed enough with Dave Sheridan so far, Dave graduated Phi Beta Kappa cum laude with a BA in economics from the Haas School of Business at UC Berkeley, and he also has an MBA from the Haas School as well. So we're super excited to hear from Dave, but before I hand things off to him, I want folks to hear from potentially one of the most important stakeholder groups that we have in the field of recovery housing, and that is recovery housing residents. So another one of our advisory board members is actually the executive director of the oldest and largest men's recovery home in Indiana. And he connected us with some of his former residents to talk about their experiences living in recovery housing and how being treated with medications for their opioid use disorder, which they refer to as MAT, affected their recovery and their recovery housing experience. And I thought it was really important to hear from residents at this point because it's a really nice framing for why it's important to understand recovery housing and to conduct research on it. So Dustin, if we could play the video now, that would be perfect.
Without recovery housing, I don't know if I would have stayed sober. it provided that structure and accountability that I needed when I was freshly out of treatment and newly sober. And without the accountability and the camaraderie of living with other people, going through the same thing as me, it just made it a lot easier, and I think it gave me the best chance at success as possible.
Recovery housing has been very helpful because it gave me the proper environment and a place to live so that I can work on my recovery and not have to worry about where I'm going to stay, who I'm going to live with, is it going to be a safe place? It removed all those worrying factors to allow me to just work on myself.
It provided stability at a time that was pretty chaotic for me. So the fact that I did not have to, granted, if I abided by the law, the rules here, the structure here, then I wouldn't have to worry about where I was going to sleep at night. Okay, and that gave me a little bit of comfort in a time that comfort was pretty hard to find.
It really helped because it reduced cravings that I would have, and allowed me to focus on recovery itself, and as well as day-to-day living, so the cravings would not interfere with, working, making sure my bills are paid, and then learning about addiction and recovery itself.
MAT helped take the pressure off there too. I could focus on my recovery, and I could focus on my therapy, and I could focus on the things that I needed to kind of lay the foundation, if you will, to kind of go forward without having to think every day, well, how am I going to do this? How am I going to do that?
It definitely was a lifesaver. It was just another layer of protection, and also another thing really to be accountable about too.
It made it just a smoother experience where I did not have to constantly think about wanting to use, because I know that's how it was before, when I was not taking MAT medications. So I think it's very beneficial for people to make it long term.
There's some people that there's still kind of some stigma attached to MATs, and I would just want everyone to know who, if they're new or trying, thinking about getting on an MAT or something like that, that everybody's recovery journey is different, right? So just because it might not work for somebody else, or if somebody thinks differently about it, if it works for you, then it works for you.
The ability to have MAT and recovery housing as well, having both of these combined really has the ability to set people up for major success, in my opinion, because I've seen it happen numerous times.
It allowed me to be a leader in my environment, and I'll explain that recovery housing is a pretty chaotic situation. You have a lot of people coming from a lot of different ways at a very vulnerable time, right? Very vulnerable and crucial time. It allowed me to be positive, and it really put it this way. I did this thing. I lived at this place for 4 months, and then I did it so well they gave me a job. So, and I get to continue to share my experience, strength, and hope in that way.
So with that sneak preview of recovery housing, Dave, I'm going to hand things off to you.
Well, thank you, Amy, and to everybody on the call. I'm just delighted to be here, and I recognize a few of the names from our monthly calls. So for those of you who are veterans, some of this material may be a little familiar. And before we dive in, I just wanted to let everybody know there's a lot of material here. This is the introductory webinar, and there's going to be lots of time to absorb and discuss in future segments of a lot of the topics that are here for in more depth. So we're going to start with just some definitions and some introductory concepts. And first, what's recovery housing? What's a recovery residence? At its simplest, it's a sober, safe, healthy living environment that promotes recovery from alcohol and other drug use and related problems. It's called different things in different parts of the country, and depending on how the home is operated, names include sober living homes, Oxford houses, recovery homes, halfway houses. But if they're truly recovery housing, they all have 5 common characteristics. The first is that they're shared housing environment, meaning that they're not single room occupancy units, they're not boarding houses, they're not treatment centers. It's where people live together as a single household. Second, they're for persons engaged in recovery for a substance use disorder. That's the one unifying thing, that characteristic that everybody shares in the residence, regardless of what other challenges they're addressing. The third is it's abstinence-based, but abstinence in our world is inclusive of medications taken as prescribed for treatment of a substance use disorder. The fourth is that residents live as a single family-like household and not as isolated tenants. The fifth is the creation and maintenance of a recovery supportive environment along social model lines. And the social model is really what we call the secret sauce. It's the element that really distinguishes recovery residences from other forms of housing for individuals who might suffer from substance use disorders. Next slide, please. The basic principles of the social model, as I mentioned, are underlying all recovery residences. The first is what we call the setting as the service. And what that means is that space, layouts, furnishings, physical surroundings, they all contribute to the recovery experience. And environment matters. And home-like settings are the best. We'll talk a little bit about different settings, but creating a home-like environment is really important. The second thing is the interconnections among individuals and between individuals and the environment. The recovery residence experience includes the chance to learn how to build healthy connections with others. This is modeled and practiced in the residence and in community interaction. We also talk about reciprocal responsibilities, which is the harmony that exists within a residence and the exchange of responsibilities with privileges. And despite all of their differences, residents unify around their mutual desire to sustain successful recoveries. And the final marker is peer governance, peer leadership, and the deference to community wisdom. And what that means is that through participation in decision-making in the residence, the individuals come to learn that their opinions and experiences are valued by others. Residents cultivate a sense of pride and co-ownership in the success of their community. And then healthy communities generate opportunities for these individuals to assume responsible service and leadership roles. Next slide. So recovery residences come in all shapes and sizes. Many fall under the Oxford House chartering system. Others are credentialed by one of our NAR state affiliates. but they vary across several dimensions. First is physical structure. So recovery residences can and most often are in single-family homes, but they can also exist in apartment or condominium blocks, properties converted from other uses, such as motels, convalescent homes, boarding houses, or they're in mixed-use buildings and purpose-built projects. They can also differ by whether the properties are owned or leased by the providers and whether the providers are nonprofit organizations or private for-profit providers. They obviously differ by where they're located in terms of urban or suburban or rural, and that kind of location matters a lot in terms of how homes operate, how they look, and the kinds of services that are offered. The size of a recovery residence can vary from quite small, 4 to 6 people, to quite large, where often there are over 100 people living in a large residence with programmatic services. The other thing that's important to know is that recovery residences support a wide variety of pathways. So that includes 12-step-based, faith-based, tribal traditions, other mutual assistance organizations, traditions, and other kinds of pathways. The two national organizations that we're talking about today, NAR and Oxford House, are the two principal standard setting and chartering organizations. And the next slide covers the differences in the kinds of services offered. So if we can go to the next slide. That vast variety of service mixes and sizes and physical footprints it makes for a kind of confusing array of service offerings. And so what NAR came up with, and it's being used fairly widely now, is a characterization of residences into one of 4 types. And we'll talk a little bit about those in more detail. But if we look across the 4 types, 1 through 4, all are characterized by being alcohol and drug-free living environments and underlaid by that social model of support. Some, which is some level 2s and all level 3s and level 4s, incorporate additional service components. And recovery support services can be as simple as shared attendance in recovery meetings, recovery activities, recreational activities. And then in the 2 higher levels, you see programming that's around life skills, whether it's parenting, how to prepare for a job interview, what we call life skills development. And level 4 is characterized by the addition of clinical services. And it's important to understand that no one level is better than the other. They simply provide different bundles of services and different intensities of services. Next slide, please. So as we just talked about, recovery housing is classified among those 4 levels. And recently, we're introducing a little bit of a new concept here, a new labeling. NAR and ASAM, the American Society for Addiction Medicine, collaborated to integrate recovery residences into the ASAM continuum of residential substance use disorder services. And the integration uses a new labeling that we created with them for purposes of making things clear to the users of the ASAM criteria. So in level 1, which you saw on the last slide, we're also calling now type P. These are all democratically run residences. There's no notion of an operator or a house manager or staff. Residents are supported by each other and set their own rules, elect their own leadership, decide who lives in the house, and is really the basis of the Oxford House program. Level 2s, which are also now called type Ms for managed, here we introduce into the residents the idea that there's at least a level of staffing that might be a peer manager, it might be a paid staff member, that monitors the community to ensure that rules are followed, models appropriate and healthy recovery habits, and provides some rules and structure to the house. But at this level, there really aren't any formal service offerings where you have staff that come and go on a frequent basis from the house. Level 3 is add a service component. So there are paid recovery support services, staff, supervision, and that emphasis on life skills. Level 4, which are also now called Type C for clinical, adds that clinical component, which has its own staffing and related considerations that go along with that. One thing I wanted to note here before we move on is variables to consider when determining the appropriate level or type and to identify a suitable residence for an individual. These include demographics, cultural background, the relative to who's residing in a given residence that's being considered, the service offerings of the residents, and the ability of the residents to meet the individual's needs where they are at the point they're looking for support. Recovery pathways. Some individuals have strong feelings about their preferences, whether it's a faith-based path or a 12-step path, or they really don't know and they just need some general guidance, and that isn't necessarily an issue for them. And also the degree of structure. You know, someone who feels they need a high level of support ought to be looking for a residence that has a fair amount of structure in the sense of activities and rules, participation requirements that really get them engaged. You know, there's no pat formula, but conversation with the service provider is always the best way to go about narrowing a search. Next slide, please. So the next set of slides, we're going to talk about oversight, organization, and funding. And we'll start with a brief overview of residence oversight. With some exceptions, recovery residences have been very lightly regulated or not regulated at all by government agencies. In fact, for a long time, they've been mostly not considered part of the established funded healthcare system, and that's starting to change. The way regulation ought best to be imposed differs a lot from the traditional healthcare licensure model. There's a lot of reasons for that, but unless a residence is delivering licensable clinical services, there's a much better approach to oversight. And the main reason for that is that recovery residences for persons with substance use disorder are considered housing for disabled individuals. And the protection for that housing is provided by several federal laws, including the Federal Fair Housing Act. And for that reason, you can't require a license to enable people with disabilities to live together in support of their disabilities. So we've evolved better systems of oversight. Both NAR and Oxford House that address those limitations. And over 20 states have officially recognized one or both of the models. Slide 14. So could we go to the next slide? I just got a little reminder for myself that I've got to move this along. So the way our ecosystem works at NAR, because it's sort of really the most specialized. Next click. The residences next join and are supported by state-level affiliate organizations that some of the logos are here. Now, these are formal affiliates of NAR, entrusted with implementing the NAR standard and support in their state. So the residences come together, become part of a state organization, and these regional organizations now number 30 and are scattered across the nation. And those organizations together and those operators and their experiences feed NAR with an endless library of best practices, innovations, and just all kinds of wisdom that you can find in our standards and in a lot of our other publications. And finally, that information cycles back to the residents, one more click, as national best practices. So it's really a circular system that begins and ends with the residences and the people they serve through this two-tiered network. Next slide. I'm going to go real quickly through this funding for residences. There's 3 different purposes for funding. One is for operating costs, also for resident access to services. You know, that's properly related staffing, programming, maintenance, all the things it takes to run a residence day to day. Another type of funding is capital funding, and that includes for property acquisitions, renovations, furnishings. And we're going to go through those 2 fairly quickly here. So the major sources of operating funds for most residences are resident fees, and in most residences, that's generally paid by the residents. For a couple of the higher levels, there are third-party payments, including Medicaid and private insurance. For clinical programs, are typically eligible for private insurance. Several states have state-level or county correctional and reentry programs that will fund access to recovery housing. And a few states are starting to make legislative appropriations to provide for housing for people where there's no other source of funding and where the need is great. And finally, Medicaid waivers in several states are making it possible to pay for at least some of the services that a residence might offer. Dominant models are really insufficient to the need. We're going to talk a little about that in later episodes, but I do want to give a shout out to some states that are really making progress on making more funding available. And that includes Virginia, Missouri, Michigan, Rhode Island, Indiana, Maine, Oklahoma, have some pretty innovative funding streams that we'd like to see more states emulate. For capital costs, the bulk of capacity is funded by some form of bank loans or savings. HUD is a limited factor in this market, but there is a small recovery housing program that was created 2 years ago. The money is funneled to state agencies, and each state decides on how they want to distribute it, but it's a very small amount of money. There's some tax credit programs that some investors could take advantage of, and then other sources at the state level could be state housing authorities, community development agencies, and as above, we've talked about legislative appropriations. A few states, including Ohio, have appropriated money specifically for capacity expansion. The third kind of funding is system support funding, and that means the money that goes to provide for support, training, workforce development services, certification and oversight functions and capacity expansion for the state's system of housing. And there's a lot of challenges and bright spots to all of this. Recovery housing still isn't as fully integrated into larger systems of care and human services, but that's a big advocacy push for a lot of us in the field over the next several years. There are some bright spots. Several states are starting to adopt funded support and recognition for NAR, Oxford House, other and standards, and all of the things that can turn a bunch of isolated resources into a really connected system. The last part of the presentation here, next slide, please. We talked about that. Next slide. We're going to talk a little bit about resources, and mostly these slides are going to be pointers to where you can find more information about recovery residences. Let's go to the next slide. Excuse me. The first source that I'd like to recommend is NAR's own website, which is naronline.org. This is a quick snapshot of who we are. The green states are where we have a state affiliate. The yellow states are part of a funded federal grant to develop affiliates, and we actually already do have one now in Oregon. And then the blue states are where we're engaged in development activities for building an affiliate from scratch, and most of those are in conjunction with a state addiction agency. And our system right now, as it sits today, is across all those green states. We support about 50,000 beds, and so it's a significant amount of capacity. Next slide. We talked a little bit about standards. On our website, you can find a copy of the NAR 3.0 standard. And I'd also like to point you to another document that's available there, which we call the Standards Compendium. So the standards are the actual list of required elements for a residence to meet in order to achieve certification and NAR recognition. The compendium talks about why those standards are what they are. It's a fairly short read, but it brings a lot of the best practices into perspective and describes why they're part of our set of requirements. Next slide. Our standards package also includes a code of ethics, and the important thing to know about that is it's binding on all staff and volunteers of every certified residence as a condition of being certified. Next slide. One of the themes of this series, of course, is medications for opioid use disorder. And this is a really important document for providers to help them navigate medications and how they can best be implemented and supported in a residence. This is written in conjunction with the National Council for Behavioral Health and C4 Innovations plus NAR. And the goal isn't just for homes to be grudgingly accepting of people prescribe these medications, but to actually become MAP capable, which means fully supportive of the needs of people in recovery that have been prescribed these medications, which often includes helping them find activities in the community, such as mutual assistance groups, that are not going to stigmatize people as not really being clean and sober. Next slide. And finally, SAMHSA has issued some guidance available on the SAMHSA website. When you get a copy of the slides, you'll see the link to that. And this is really a set of guidelines about what you should look for in a residence, the kinds of characteristics you'll find, and it roughly parallels our standard. We collaborated in a little bit in helping write this. I should point out, though, that this is in the process of being rewritten in collaboration with Oxford House and NAR and other stakeholders. So look for a republication of this sometime later this year, maybe early next year. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Amy. Thank you, Amy.
Well, thank you, Dave. It was a very tall order for you to summarize all of recovery housing in 15 minutes, but you did a spectacular job. And if folks want to hear more about any of the topics that Dave covered, I encourage you to come back and be part of the provider training series, because we'll do a deeper dive on a lot of the topics that Dave only had time to touch briefly on today. So I'm going to switch gears a little bit and talk about the state of research on recovery housing, which is pretty good. And whenever I'm asked to talk about the evidence base for recovery housing, I'm always really pleased to say that it's strong and ever growing. So for example, the evidence base for things like therapeutic communities at the clinical end of the spectrum, as well as for Oxford houses at the opposite end of the spectrum, the peer governed residences, is actually quite strong and robust. There's also strong evidence for sober living houses in California, and the research on other types of recovery housing in different parts of the country is growing as well. And while it's not as well researched as mutual help or interventions like 12-step facilitation, certainly not like interventions like CBT, it's one of the most researched types of recovery support services. In fact, even at this stage, enough research has accumulated that SAMHSA has provided a resource for it on its Evidence-Based Practices Resource Center, as Dave showed in the prior slide. So I want to draw your attention to a review of the evidence that was conducted in 2014 by another one of our advisory board members, Dr. Sharon Reef. So she and her colleagues reviewed the findings and the quality of the research conducted on recovery housing at the time. And again, this was about 10 years ago. But these researchers assessed the level of evidence on recovery housing to be moderate and highlighted that studies consistently showed positive outcomes with respect to alcohol and drug use, employment, and psychiatric symptoms. However, they also noted that research findings were tempered by study design limitations and a small number of studies, despite a large numbers of publications. Next slide, please. So more research on recovery housing has been conducted since then. So there are more studies, but some of the critiques of the recovery housing literature remain because there are some inherent challenges to conducting research on recovery housing. So I've highlighted on this slide a paper led by my colleague Doug Polson, which describes these challenges, but also the rewards of conducting research on recovery housing. And some of the challenges identified are related to recovery housing operating largely outside of the formal substance use continuum of care, which can make studying recovery housing slightly more difficult than studying interventions and services received while folks are in substance use treatment programs. Now, these challenges are by no means insurmountable or even necessarily that unique to studying recovery housing, but given how hard conducting research can be to begin with, without additional training and support, launching research in this area can be difficult. And we're hoping that the I-STARR researcher training series will help minimize these challenges. We also hope that it will help spur research to close key gaps in the literature. For example, it's important that outcomes and effectiveness research continues across the full spectrum of recovery housing. And there's also still a great deal to learn regarding how and for whom recovery housing works or works best. What researchers like to call the mechanisms and moderators of recovery housing. And what do I mean by this? So studies of the mechanisms of recovery housing attempt to get at how recovery housing works and how it improves outcomes. It's research looking under the hood. It's research identifying key ingredients in the secret sauce or what's going on inside the black box. So this sort of research is important because it can identify integral elements of recovery housing and what the essential components of recovery housing are. So this sort of work is reflected by Dr. Lenny Jason's and Doug Polson's work on social support, social networks, and the kinds of helping behaviors that take place within the context of recovery housing. I'm also really excited by work looking at recovery capital or resources that people need to further their recovery, and how recovery housing fosters recovery capital. But we're also missing research on moderators of recovery housing. And this is research that examines whether recovery housing differentially benefits some group of residents more than others, and how recovery housing can better address these residents' needs. And while some of this work has started looking at the effectiveness of recovery housing for folks involved in the criminal legal system, women and children, and members of the LGBT community, we need more. And one group of folks who is particularly timely to study are those with opioid use disorders who are taking medications for opioid use disorders. Next slide, please. And why would it be important to study folks taking medications for their opioid use disorder and their experience in recovery housing? Well, I think recovery housing is important for that group for the same reason that it's important for everyone or anyone who's in recovery. But those who are suffering or in recovery for opioid use disorders face additional challenges in their recovery due to how opioids physiologically affect those who become addicted to them. But fortunately, there are medications to help address these physiological changes by reducing or eliminating withdrawal symptoms, or blunting or blocking the effects of illicit opioids. But as we know, that physiology is just one important aspect of addiction, and there are other aspects of addiction that can be addressed within the context of treatment and recovery support services, and within the context of recovery housing. And that's really what we want to make sure that we research and support the research on in the I-STARR project. Because while there's been some research that has examined the experience of individuals living in recovery housing with opioid use disorders, and some research looking at attitudes towards medications for opioid use disorders, we're really missing a great deal on the effectiveness of recovery housing for persons who are taking medications for opioid use disorder as part of their recovery. Next slide, please. So like Dave, I wanted to list some key resources for folks who might want to know more about research on recovery housing. So I pasted in some key articles on the recovery housing landscape, what recovery housing is, as well as the evidence base for it. But I've also pasted in some websites, the website listing Lenny Jason's team's research on Oxford houses, Doug Polson's research on sober living houses, as well as research on therapeutic communities. And we can also drop these website links into the chat box as well. So next slide, please. So I feel like we've done a whirlwind overview of recovery housing and the evidence base for recovery housing. And I want to make sure that we answer any questions that folks might have on these topics. So we do have a couple of minutes for Q&A. And I don't know if folks have been dropping questions in the chat along the way, but if you do have questions, please feel free to raise them. You can either raise your hand or, like I said, you can drop your question into the chat. Diane, were there any questions that came up during the presentation?
I'm just looking through the chat now to see if there were any questions. Please drop them in the chat if you do have any, or just raise your hand as well.
There was a question about whether these slides will be made available.
That is an excellent question, one that's easy to answer. They will be posted on our website. Actually, a recording of the webinar will be available to folks on the website, and should be hopefully available within the next week or so. Well, as we're creeping up to the top of the hour, I can actually tell you a little bit more about what is coming up with the I-STARR project. Actually, if we can go back to the slides, either Diane or Dustin.
Can I ask a quick question, Amy?
Oh, sure.
Sorry, I raised my hand, but I'm not sure if you
Oh,
saw it.
sorry, Lauren, I didn't see that.
No,
Go
that's
ahead.
fine. I'm wondering how you suggest researchers handle the heterogeneity of recovery houses and what each of them look like and what they offer and who potentially might be interacting with the clients and or the people who are living in the house. And it seems like there's so much there to grapple with that it seems kind of chaotic to me, but I'm sure that there are ways that you've identified to enhance research in that area.
So I think that's a great question. So there is a broad spectrum, as Dave showed in his slide. And I think that the first step is really understanding what's being delivered in the recovery housing that you're studying, and to try and place that in context and to map that onto research on those kinds of recovery houses that are similar to that. If it's there, that's great. But if it's not, that's exciting too, because you may be describing something that's not existing in the literature. To answer your question, Lauren, the first step is really understanding what's being provided within the recovery housing itself.
Sort of evaluating the resources versus the construct of recovery housing more broadly. Is that right?
Yep, the services, how the recovery house operates, and the different characteristics of the house itself.
Awesome, thank you.
So actually, if we could go to the next slide, I just want to give folks a heads up of what's coming down the road with I-STARR. So there are some activities in June. We're going to be evaluating our pilot studies for our first open announcement for competitive pilot study funding. But in July, we'll have more of our training series. We actually are splitting our training series into two components starting in July. There's going to be a training for recovery residence providers. And by that, we mean owners, operators, house manager, as well as residents with any kind of operational or responsibilities within the house. We encourage those folks to attend the provider series, but also a separate track for researchers, folks who are wanting to learn more about how to conduct recovery housing research. And we have some really great presentations lined up. So in the provider series, I think next month we'll have Beth Fisher-Sanders, and she'll talk about the recovery housing environment and supports provided within recovery housing. In the researcher track, we'll have three different presenters. We'll actually have Michael Shropshire from UCSF talking about experimental and quasi-experimental designs. And we'll have Doug Polson and Lenny Jason talking about their research employing these different kinds of designs in their studies of recovery housing. So I hope I see you guys back here at a webinar either next month or down the road. Let's see, next slide, please. At this point, I want to make sure that before folks leave, I talk a little bit about the series itself. So if you've registered for the provider training series or the researcher training series, if you attend all 12 webinars, you will get a certificate at the end of those 12 webinars. And you will also have the opportunity to have your name listed on the I-STARR website as attending those webinars. For those who are registered for the provider series, or who are thinking about registering for the provider series, the 12 webinars in that series, we do offer CEU credits through NADAC for folks who complete that provider training series. So as you're exiting the meeting, folks who are involved in the provider series, please make sure you fill out the exit survey, the evaluation at the end. It will pop up when you leave in your browser as a quick survey. It is just, I think, 5 or 6 different questions, but that's how we'll be able to track your participation and your involvement in the provider training series so that at the end you can get the 12 CEU credits. And with that, we are at the top of the hour, and I feel bad because we didn't have a lot of time for discussion. But please feel free to put your questions into the chat if you have any remaining. And I am just really pleased by the turnout that we had for this webinar, and I really do hope that we have folks return for next month's webinars, and that you can visit the I-STARR website to learn more about the training series and different webinars that will be coming down the road.